The moment the alien queen spoke my thoughts out loud was the moment the entire hall forgot how to breathe. But to understand how a human janitor ended up inside the most powerful council chamber in the galaxy, you have to rewind a few minutes to when I was standing on a maintenance ladder with a wrench in my hand wondering why the richest diplomats in the universe couldn't keep a simple translation console from overheating. My name is Daniel Hayes, and back on Earth I used to fix HVAC systems in Phoenix, where summer days hit 110 degrees like it was normal, but somehow that skill set had landed me light years from home inside the Imperial Council Hall. A place built from towering pillars of polished crystal that stretched nearly 80 feet toward a domed ceiling glowing with slow drifting constellations projected by alien technology older than human civilization. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something sweet I couldn't name, and the polished black floor reflected dozens of alien delegates gathered for what they called a historic treaty summit, which in plain English meant a room full of powerful species pretending they trusted each other. I was only there because the central translator array had started glitching again, and apparently humans were still the cheapest technicians in the galaxy. My ladder stood just behind the diplomatic gallery, close enough that I could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the room as ambassadors with skin like polished stone or shimmering turquoise whispered through translation implants, while security drones floated silently along the walls. Every few seconds, I tightened a bolt or wiped condensation from a cooling pipe, while trying not to stare at the throne platform at the far end of the hall, where the most famous figure in the Alliance was about to arrive. Queen Aerith of the Luminari Dominion. I had seen pictures in the news feeds, but seeing her in person when the massive doors finally opened was something else entirely. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her skin glowing faintly blue beneath the chamber lights, silver hair flowing like liquid metal down her back, while a long mantle shimmered with patterns that shifted like starlight. The entire hall fell quiet as she walked toward the throne platform, not the awkward silence of a meeting running late, but the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Even the floating security drones slowed their patrol like they were nervous to make noise. I remember tightening the last bolt on the translator console and thinking something I absolutely should have kept inside my head. Something simple and sarcastic the way mechanics think when they're stuck fixing expensive machines for people who barely notice them. I glanced across the rows of alien delegates and thought, these people don't trust each other at all. They're just better at pretending. I didn't say it. I didn't whisper it. I barely even moved. But the instant the thought crossed my mind, the queen stopped walking. Slowly, she turned her head. Her golden eyes locked directly onto me across the enormous hall, and then, in a calm voice that carried through every corner of the chamber, she spoke the exact words I had just thought. For a few seconds no one moved, not the delegates seated along the crescent-shaped tiers, not the hovering security drones drifting along the ceiling nearly 70 feet above the polished floor, and definitely not me, standing halfway up a maintenance ladder with a wrench still clutched in my hand, as the words the queen had just spoken echoed through the chamber exactly the way they had formed inside my head moments earlier. The translator console hummed softly beside my shoulder, its cooling fans spinning at a steady rhythm, but every other sound in the enormous hall seemed to vanish as dozens of alien diplomats slowly turned their attention toward the one human who was absolutely not supposed to be part of the conversation. My first thought was that I had somehow spoken out loud without realizing it. So I instinctively covered my mouth with my hand and glanced down at the polished floor where the reflection staring back at me looked just as confused as I felt. Queen Aerith had stopped at the base of the throne platform, her tall silhouette framed by the soft starlight projection glowing across the ceiling, and those luminous golden eyes were still fixed directly on me with a calm focus that felt less like anger and more like curiosity. Around the hall, whispers began spreading between the delegates as their translation implants struggled to keep up with overlapping languages, soft clicking tones, melodic pulses, and voices that sounded like wind moving through glass chimes. I heard one of the security officers murmur something into a wrist communicator while a pair of tall scholars with violet skin leaned toward each other, clearly trying to understand what had just happened. My ladder creaked slightly as I climbed down the final step, suddenly very aware that I was the only human in a room designed for species that considered themselves far more advanced than we were. Back on Earth, I had fixed air conditioners in strip malls and apartment buildings where the most complicated problem was usually a faulty thermostat, and now somehow I was standing inside a chamber larger than a football field while the most powerful ruler in the Alliance stared at me like I had just broken a universal law of physics. I cleared my throat, which sounded embarrassingly loud in the silence, and raised both hands in a small, helpless gesture. I did not say that out loud, Your Majesty, I said carefully, making sure every word came out slow and clear through the translator implant resting behind my ear. A ripple moved through the chamber as several delegates turned their attention back to the Queen, waiting for her response. For a moment she said nothing. She simply studied me with that same steady gaze as if she were examining a rare instrument she had never seen before. Then she took one quiet step forward across the marble platform, her voice calm and precise as it carried through the hall, without the help of any microphone. I know, Daniel Hayes. The way she said my full name sent a strange chill up my spine because I had definitely not introduced myself. The whispers around the chamber stopped again. Even the translator console beside me seemed to lower its hum as if the machines themselves were listening. The Queen tilted her head slightly, silver hair shifting like liquid light across her shoulders, and spoke a sentence that made every alien in the chamber lean forward in disbelief. I did not hear your voice, she said softly. I heard your mind. The words settled over the chamber like a sudden drop in gravity, and for a moment my brain refused to process what the Queen had just said, because there were only two possibilities and neither one made any sense. I stood there staring at her while the translator console beside me continued its steady hum and the polished floor reflected the silent crowd of diplomats who were now watching us like an audience waiting for the next line in a play no one had rehearsed. My mind was racing through explanations the way mechanics check through possible faults in a machine. Maybe the translator system had glitched again. Maybe the Queen had extremely good hearing and guessed my expression somehow. Maybe this entire thing was an elaborate diplomatic test, and the human janitor had accidentally wandered into the middle of it. But none of those explanations held together for more than a second because I knew exactly what I had done, and it was nothing. I had tightened a bolt. I had thought something sarcastic. That was it. Yet the Queen had repeated the exact sentence I had formed inside my head word for word. Around the chamber, several delegates leaned toward one another again, their voices forming a low ripple of sound that traveled through the hall like wind moving across tall grass. I heard a translator relay fragments in my ear. Impossible. Human cognition is not telepathically receptive. Perhaps a recording device. Scan the technician. A pair of tall scholars seated near the front adjusted the glowing bands around their temples, which I recognized as telepathic amplifiers used by certain species that communicated through neural resonance instead of spoken language. Their expressions were not angry or frightened. They were confused in the way scientists look when a simple equation suddenly refuses to work. Queen Aerith remained perfectly still at the base of the platform, her posture relaxed but her gaze never leaving me. There was something almost thoughtful in her expression, as if she were listening to a distant sound only she could hear. I swallowed and tried to steady my breathing because every instinct I had was telling me that the smartest move would be to quietly step down from the ladder, apologize for existing, and walk out of the hall before anyone decided to turn the human maintenance worker into a research project. Your Majesty, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm enough for the translator to catch every word clearly. I am fairly certain that human thoughts are supposed to stay inside the human head. A few diplomats shifted in their seats as the translator repeated my sentence across a dozen languages. The Queen tilted her head slightly again, and for a brief moment the faint blue glow of her skin brightened, as if reacting to something invisible in the air. I know, she replied in the same calm tone as before, and that is precisely why this is interesting. One of the scholars with the glowing headband rose from his seat and spoke quickly in a language that sounded like soft glass tapping together. The translator in my ear converted it a second later. Your Majesty, no telepath in this chamber detected a neural broadcast from the human. The Queen did not even glance at him. Instead, she took another slow step forward across the marble floor and spoke the next words so quietly that the entire hall leaned in to hear them. That is because there was no broadcast. I did not sense his thoughts the way my kind senses others. She paused, studying me with a mixture of curiosity and something I could not quite identify. I heard them because, unlike every mind in this room, his is completely silent. The reaction inside the hall did not explode into chaos the way I expected. Instead, something stranger happened. The entire chamber seemed to tighten with attention, like a massive machine shifting into a new gear. Dozens of alien diplomats leaned forward in their seats, their eyes fixed on me as if I had suddenly become the most interesting object in the universe. I stood there beside the translator console feeling very aware that I was still holding a wrench in my right hand, and that the cooling pipe I had been repairing was quietly dripping condensation onto the polished floor. The words the Queen had just spoken echoed in my mind. Completely silent. That was not exactly how I would have described my thoughts. My brain usually sounded like a toolbox sliding around in the back of a pickup truck. But the scholars wearing telepathic amplifiers were already conferring with each other in low voices, while their glowing headbands pulsed brighter with each passing second. One of them stepped forward from the semicircle of delegates and addressed the Queen with the careful tone of someone presenting a scientific observation that might change a few textbooks. Your Majesty, our instruments detect no neural interference from the human technician. His cognitive patterns appear unusually stable. The translator repeated the sentence in my ear, and I almost laughed because stable was definitely not the word my high school teachers would have used. Queen Aerith slowly climbed the shallow steps toward the throne platform, but stopped halfway, as if reconsidering the distance between us. Instead of taking the seat waiting behind her, she turned and faced the hall again, one hand resting lightly against the smooth railing. Her presence carried the kind of quiet authority that made every other voice in the chamber fade. For centuries, my people have relied on telepathic resonance to communicate truthfully with one another, she said calmly, her voice traveling through the chamber without effort. But resonance is never perfect. Every mind produces noise. Emotion, fear, ambition, hidden intentions. The scholars nodded slowly as if this were an obvious statement of physics. Even I understood the concept. Anyone who had ever tried to tune an old radio knew the problem. Too many signals crowded together, and everything turned into static. The Queen looked back toward me again, those golden eyes thoughtful rather than threatening. Yet when I listened to the human mind, she continued, I heard something different. The chamber grew so quiet that the faint hum of the ceiling drones sounded suddenly loud. No noise. No interference. Just a single clear thought. A murmur spread through the delegates again as several of the telepathic scholars adjusted their amplifiers and turned their attention toward me with intense curiosity. One of them whispered a sentence that the translator quickly converted in my ear. That is not possible. Human neural architecture does not support psionic clarity. I raised my hands again in a small shrug because at that moment I felt like the least qualified person in the galaxy to explain my own brain. Your Majesty, I said carefully, I fix air conditioning systems and broken translators. I am fairly certain I do not possess any special mental equipment. A few delegates produced sounds that might have been laughter in their own languages, but the Queen simply watched me with that same steady focus. Perhaps not intentionally, she replied, but that does not make it less remarkable. She paused for a moment as if listening again to something only she could hear, and when she spoke next her voice carried a note of quiet wonder that made the entire chamber lean forward. For the first time in many years, she said softly, I am hearing what a mind truly sounds like when it is not trying to hide anything. The silence that followed the Queen's words felt heavier than any sound, the kind of quiet that settles over a room when everyone realizes something important has just happened, but no one knows what it means yet. I stood beside the translator console, trying very hard not to look like the center of attention, which was difficult considering several dozen alien diplomats were now staring at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. The cooling pipe behind me released a soft hiss as the system adjusted pressure, and a faint breeze from the ventilation grid brushed across my sleeves, reminding me that 10 minutes ago I had been thinking about nothing more complicated than finishing a repair job before lunch. Now the most powerful leader in the Alliance was discussing the structure of my brain like it was a newly discovered scientific instrument. One of the telepathic scholars stepped forward again, his violet skin reflecting the soft blue glow of the chamber lights as the bands around his temples brightened. Your Majesty, he said carefully, The possibility exists that the human mind produces a narrow resonance channel rather than the broad neural emissions common among telepathic species. The translator delivered his sentence into my ear with mechanical precision, while the delegates around him murmured in curiosity. In simpler terms, another scholar added a moment later, the human mind may not be silent. It may simply be clear. That word moved through the chamber like a ripple across water. Clear. I shifted my weight slightly, suddenly aware that I was still holding the wrench from the maintenance kit clipped to my belt. I considered quietly setting it down somewhere, but decided that moving too much might attract even more attention, which seemed almost impossible at that point. Queen Aerith descended the remaining steps of the platform slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, until she stood on the polished floor of the chamber only 20 feet away from where I was standing. Up close, the faint blue glow of her skin looked less like light and more like moonlight reflected on calm water. Her golden eyes studied me again with the thoughtful focus of someone examining a puzzle that had appeared without warning. "Daniel Hayes," she said, pronouncing my name with perfect clarity through the translator network. "What were you thinking a moment ago before I spoke?" The question caught me off guard, mostly because I had assumed the entire room already knew the answer. I hesitated for a second, glancing at the rows of diplomats who were now leaning forward in their seats like spectators waiting for the next line of dialogue. I was thinking that everyone in this room looked very serious about a treaty that none of them seemed to fully trust, I admitted honestly. A low murmur spread through the chamber again, but the Queen did not react with offense. Instead, something almost like amusement flickered briefly across her expression. "Yes," she said quietly. "That was exactly the thought I heard." She paused, and for a moment her gaze drifted across the hall, taking in the delegates who were now watching both of us with intense interest. For centuries, telepaths have listened to minds layered with doubt, calculation, and hidden intention, she said slowly, her voice calm, but carrying clearly to every corner of the chamber. Yet when this human thinks, his mind does not conceal its meaning. The scholars exchanged glances as their amplifiers pulsed again, clearly trying to measure something that their instruments had never encountered before. The Queen returned her attention to me and spoke the next words softly, almost as if she were sharing a discovery rather than making an announcement. "Your thoughts do not echo through the noise of ambition or fear. They arrive alone, like a signal traveling through empty space." She tilted her head slightly, studying me with renewed curiosity, and that makes them very easy to hear. For several long seconds no one in the chamber spoke, and the quiet that settled over the Imperial Council Hall felt almost physical, like the still air before a storm, except there was no tension in it. Only an intense curiosity that seemed to pull every pair of eyes toward the human standing beside a maintenance console with a wrench still in his hand. I shifted my grip on the tool and slowly set it down on the edge of the panel, figuring that looking slightly less like a repair technician and slightly more like a responsible citizen might improve my situation. The polished floor reflected the tall shape of Queen Aerith as she stood only a short distance away from me, her silver hair catching the soft light from the ceiling projections that simulated distant stars drifting across the dome nearly 80 feet above us. Around the curved tiers of seating, the alien delegates were speaking quietly among themselves again, but the tone had changed from confusion to fascination. The scholars wearing telepathic amplifiers had now formed a small semicircle several yards away, their glowing headbands pulsing in slow synchronized patterns as if they were running careful measurements through instruments that had suddenly discovered a completely new signal. One of them spoke again, his voice steady but unmistakably excited. "Your Majesty, if the human cognitive field truly produces a narrow resonance channel, it may explain why our sensors detect almost no psychic interference." His thoughts would not compete with surrounding neural activity. The translator in my ear converted his words instantly, and I had the strange experience of listening to scientists discuss my brain while I was still standing inside it. Queen Aerith did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied me with the patient focus of someone trying to understand how an unfamiliar device actually worked. "Daniel Hayes," she said after a moment, her voice calm and clear through the hall, "would you be willing to think something intentionally?" The request was so unexpected that I almost laughed, but the seriousness of the room stopped the sound before it escaped. "Think something intentionally," I repeated, just to make sure I had heard correctly. Yes, the Queen replied gently. A simple thought. Something ordinary. The scholars leaned forward at once, their amplifiers glowing brighter, and several delegates shifted in their seats so they could see me more clearly. I rubbed the back of my neck for a second, trying to figure out what counted as an appropriate thought when half the galaxy was apparently listening. All right, I said finally, glancing around the massive chamber again. I will try something simple. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured the first thing that came to mind, which happened to be the small apartment back on Earth where the air conditioner had broken during a summer heat wave, and I had spent 3 hours fixing it for a neighbor who had rewarded me with a cold bottle of lemonade. It was not a dramatic memory, just a quiet image of sunlight through a kitchen window and condensation running down a glass on a 90-degree afternoon. I opened my eyes. Again, the Queen was smiling slightly. Lemonade, she said softly. The word echoed across the chamber as dozens of alien delegates exchanged stunned glances. You were remembering a glass of cold lemonade on a hot day. The word lemonade drifted across the chamber like a strange piece of music that no one quite recognized, and for a moment the delegates simply stared at the Queen as if waiting for her to clarify whether she was joking or announcing some profound diplomatic insight. I blinked at her in surprise because that had been exactly what I pictured in my mind. Not just the word, but the entire memory of a glass sweating in the summer heat, sunlight spilling across a kitchen counter, the faint hum of an air conditioner finally working again after hours of repair. Around the hall, the scholars reacted instantly, their amplifiers glowing brighter as they exchanged rapid observations in low voices that the translator struggled to keep up with. The human produced a voluntary cognitive image. The Queen reproduced the concept with perfect accuracy. There is still no detectable psychic broadcast. The phrases flowed through my earpiece one after another while the room filled with a rising murmur of astonishment. Queen Aerith did not appear surprised at all. She simply looked at me with quiet interest, as if confirming a hypothesis she had suspected from the beginning. That memory was simple, she said calmly, but it carried a clear emotional signature. Relief from heat. Satisfaction after work. A small moment of comfort. The translator repeated her words across the chamber, and several delegates leaned back in their seats, clearly trying to understand how she could describe a human memory in such detail. I rubbed my forehead, half amused and half uneasy. Your Majesty, I said slowly, I promise that my thoughts are usually far less poetic than that. Most of the time, I am thinking about broken compressors and overdue maintenance schedules. A faint ripple of amusement moved through the hall, though it sounded very different depending on the species producing it. The Queen tilted her head slightly again, listening in that strange attentive way she seemed to use whenever my mind wandered. Try another thought, she suggested gently. Something you have not already remembered. I glanced around the enormous hall again, suddenly aware that this had turned into the strangest demonstration in the history of diplomatic meetings. Rows of alien ambassadors watched me expectantly, while the scholars leaned forward with glowing instruments ready to record every signal my brain might produce. I took a slow breath and tried to think of something neutral. My eyes drifted upward toward the domed ceiling where artificial constellations shimmered softly against the dark surface like distant galaxies. Without really trying, I imagined the night sky back on Earth, the way it looked from a quiet desert outside Phoenix when the air cooled after sunset and the stars appeared so bright it felt like you could almost touch them. I pictured standing there with nothing but open land around me and a thermos of coffee in my hand, while the Milky Way stretched across the horizon like a river of light. When I lowered my gaze again, Queen Aerith was still watching me with that same calm curiosity. The desert sky, she said softly. Warm air cooling after sunset. Coffee in a metal thermos. This time the reaction from the scholars was immediate and unmistakable. Their amplifiers flashed in synchronized bursts while several of them spoke at once. The resonance pattern is stable. The clarity is extraordinary. One of the delegates near the front leaned toward another and whispered something that the translator relayed a moment later. He is not broadcasting thoughts. The Queen is listening to them the way one hears a single voice in a silent room. The scholars did not even try to hide their excitement now. Their glowing amplifiers pulsed in rapid sequences while streams of translated observations whispered through the chamber like the sound of wind moving through tall glass instruments. Measurements are consistent. No psychic emission detected. Cognitive clarity remains isolated. The phrases echoed through my translator while I stood there feeling like someone had accidentally placed a maintenance worker in the middle of a scientific breakthrough. Queen Aerith remained perfectly calm amid the growing energy in the room. If anything, she seemed more relaxed than before, as though the discovery had lifted a burden she had carried for a long time. She slowly walked a few steps closer until only about 15 feet separated us, the polished floor reflecting the faint blue glow of her skin like moonlight on water. Daniel Hayes, she said gently, what you are doing is not extraordinary for you. You are simply thinking. Yet for those of us who rely on telepathic perception, the experience is unusual. Around the chamber, several delegates shifted forward again in their seats. One tall ambassador with dark crimson skin raised a hand slightly and spoke toward the throne platform. Your Majesty, are you suggesting that human cognition contains no hidden neural layers? The translator converted the question instantly, and a few of the scholars nodded, as if the inquiry matched their own thoughts. Queen Aerith considered the question for a moment. Every mind contains depth, she replied calmly. Humans are capable of imagination, doubt, memory, hope. Those are not absent from Daniel Hayes. But his thoughts do not fragment the way telepathic minds often do. She turned her gaze toward the assembled diplomats. Most species learn to shield their intentions from one another because they live surrounded by minds that constantly brush against their own. Over time, those shields create complexity, layers within layers, signals within signals. The scholars exchanged thoughtful looks as her explanation spread through the hall. The queen looked back at me again and continued quietly. But the human mind evolved differently. Your thoughts travel alone. When you think something, it is not hidden behind 10 other thoughts attempting to protect it. It arrives clearly. I rubbed the back of my neck again, trying to process the idea that my ordinary thinking process had suddenly become the subject of an interstellar lecture. I am not sure if I should feel complimented or slightly exposed, I admitted. A few delegates produced soft tones that the translator identified as amusement. Queen Aerith allowed herself a faint smile. Honesty can feel uncomfortable when others finally hear it, she said. But it is also refreshing. She paused again, listening inwardly in that quiet way she seemed to have whenever my thoughts drifted. The scholars noticed it too, and their amplifiers brightened as if waiting for another signal. A moment later the queen spoke once more, though this time her voice carried a note of quiet wonder rather than analysis. For most of my life, every mind around me has sounded like a crowded marketplace filled with overlapping voices. She looked directly at me. Yours sounds like a single conversation in an empty room. The hall fell silent again as the meaning of that statement settled across the chamber. One of the scholars finally whispered the conclusion that several of them had clearly reached at the same time. Your Majesty, if the human mind truly produces that level of clarity, then a telepath could listen to it without interference from surrounding neural activity. Queen Aerith nodded slowly. Yes, she said softly. That is exactly why I heard him the moment he thought something honest. The chamber remained unusually quiet after the queen's last statement, but this time the silence felt different, not confused or shocked, but thoughtful, as if every mind in the room was carefully turning the same idea over and examining it from every angle. I could almost feel the shift in the atmosphere, even though I was the only one there without a telepathic amplifier or a diplomatic title attached to my name. A few minutes ago, I had been a maintenance technician fixing a faulty translator console. Now the entire council seemed to be reconsidering something fundamental about the human mind. One of the senior scholars stepped forward again, his glowing headband pulsing steadily as he addressed the queen with careful respect. Your Majesty, if this phenomenon is confirmed, it suggests that humans may possess a rare cognitive advantage in environments saturated with telepathic interference. The translator repeated his words through my earpiece, and several ambassadors immediately began whispering to one another, their voices creating a low ripple of speculation across the hall. Another scholar spoke next, this one adjusting a thin crystalline device that hovered near her temple. In telepathic assemblies, most species must constantly filter competing neural signals. The human brain may not produce such signals, which means a telepath could focus on a human mind with perfect clarity even in a crowded environment. I shifted my weight slightly beside the console, wondering how many ways a simple brain could be analyzed before someone remembered that it still belonged to a person who had not planned on attending an interstellar summit that morning. Queen Aerith listened patiently to the discussion, her expression calm and thoughtful as the scholars presented their observations. Finally, she raised one hand slightly, and the quiet ripple of voices faded almost instantly. The hall settled again into attentive silence. "What you are describing is not merely an advantage," she said softly. "It may represent a form of cognitive transparency that telepathic civilizations have not experienced for centuries." Her gaze moved slowly across the chamber, meeting the eyes of diplomats from dozens of worlds before returning to me. "For generations we have relied on the ability to sense hidden intentions within the thoughts of others. Yet that ability also created a world where no mind was ever truly quiet. Every conversation carried echoes of suspicion, ambition, or caution." The scholars nodded again, clearly recognizing the truth in her words. The queen turned slightly toward me and continued in a calm, reflective tone. "But when Daniel Hayes thinks, there is no wall of competing signals around his thoughts. His mind presents a single clear idea without distortion." A few ambassadors exchanged thoughtful glances at that statement, and one of them leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that the translator quietly relayed into my ear a moment later. "If that clarity can be trusted, it may represent the most reliable form of communication in the chamber." I blinked at that, not entirely sure how a guy who spent most of his time fixing air conditioning systems had suddenly become an example of reliable diplomacy. Queen Aerith seemed to notice my confusion because a faint smile touched her expression again. "Daniel Hayes," she said gently, "you are wondering why a simple thought about lemonade and desert skies has captured the attention of an entire council." I nodded slightly because that was exactly what I had been wondering. The queen looked around the chamber one more time before answering, her voice calm, but carrying unmistakable meaning. "Because for the first time in a very long time, every telepath in this room just heard a mind that was not trying to hide anything at all." The words settled over the council chamber with a weight that no announcement or treaty ever could have carried, and for several long moments no one spoke, because the idea the queen had just expressed was slowly unfolding inside dozens of very analytical minds. A mind that was not trying to hide anything. I stood there beside the translator console, feeling oddly exposed and oddly relieved at the same time, like someone had just read my diary aloud and then decided it was surprisingly honest instead of embarrassing. Around the chamber, the delegates exchanged quiet comments while the scholars continued scanning the readings from their telepathic amplifiers, their glowing instruments pulsing in smooth patterns that suggested confirmation rather than confusion. One of them finally stepped forward again, adjusting a floating display that projected streams of neural measurements into the air between him and the queen. "Your Majesty, the pattern remains unchanged," he reported carefully. "The human cognitive signal is isolated and stable. No layered shielding structures detected." The translator repeated the statement in my ear, and I had to suppress a small laugh, because apparently my brain was now being described with the same language engineers used to talk about signal cables and communication channels. Queen Aerith listened without interrupting, her expression calm and thoughtful. Then she turned slowly toward the curved rows of ambassadors surrounding the chamber. "For centuries we believed that advanced communication required increasingly complex mental defenses," she said quietly. "Telepathic civilizations evolved layers of thought in order to protect themselves from one another. Intentions became hidden beneath interpretation. Honesty became filtered through caution." Several delegates nodded as she spoke, clearly recognizing the truth in that observation. "But complexity is not the same as clarity," the queen continued. "When minds become crowded with protection and suspicion, the signal beneath them grows harder to hear." She paused briefly and then looked back at me with that same thoughtful curiosity. "Yet this human stands here without such defenses because his species never needed them. He does not conceal his thoughts from telepaths because humans evolved in a world where thoughts could only be spoken aloud." The scholars murmured again as that realization settled through the hall. One of them whispered a conclusion that the translator quietly relayed into my ear a moment later. "That means human cognition developed without psychic interference. Their thoughts were shaped for direct communication, not mental concealment." I folded my arms slightly, suddenly aware that I had never considered my brain from that perspective before. Back on Earth, honesty was not exactly considered a scientific phenomenon. It was usually just called being straightforward. Queen Aerith seemed to sense the direction of my thoughts because a faint smile appeared again at the corner of her lips. Daniel Hayes, she said gently, you believe that your thoughts are ordinary. I shrugged slightly. Most days they are about repair schedules and grocery lists, I admitted. The delegates produced another ripple of soft amusement at that answer. But the Queen shook her head slowly. No, she said. Your thoughts are not extraordinary because they are complex. They are extraordinary because they are simple enough to be understood without distortion. She looked around the chamber. Once more, her voice gaining a quiet authority that silenced every whisper. For the first time in generations, every telepath present has just experienced what communication feels like when a mind speaks exactly what it means. The chamber remained quiet after the Queen finished speaking, but this time the silence felt deeper, almost reflective, as if every delegate present was reconsidering how communication itself had worked for their entire civilization. I stood beside the translator console with my hands resting loosely against the metal panel, trying to process the idea that a thought about lemonade and a desert sky had somehow turned into a lesson about the structure of intelligent minds. Around the hall, the scholars continued reviewing the neural readings projected above their instruments, their amplifiers glowing steadily rather than flashing with surprise. One of them finally spoke again, his tone calmer now that the initial shock had faded. Your Majesty, if humans naturally think without layered mental shielding, it may explain why their cognitive signals remain so coherent in the presence of telepaths. The translator repeated the observation, and several ambassadors nodded slowly. Another delegate leaned forward slightly, his voice thoughtful as he addressed the Queen. That would also mean that human honesty is not simply cultural behavior. It may be neurological. The idea drifted through the chamber like a quiet ripple, and I felt a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment because no one back home had ever described human bluntness as a scientific feature before. Queen Aerith folded her hands lightly in front of her and considered the delegates with calm patience. Honesty is not unique to humans, she said softly. Many species value truth. But most telepathic civilizations evolved to protect their inner thoughts long before they ever developed formal diplomacy. Over time, that protection became habit. Thought hides beneath thought. Intention hides beneath interpretation. She paused for a moment before continuing in a reflective tone. Humans never faced that pressure. Their minds were shaped by a world where the only way to share an idea was to speak it aloud. Because of that, the human brain appears to structure thoughts differently. Clear intention forms first, and only afterward do humans decide whether to speak it. A scholar nodded immediately at that explanation while adjusting a floating data screen. That would create exactly the signal pattern we are observing, he said. The thought forms as a single complete structure instead of multiple defensive layers. I scratched my chin thoughtfully because that description sounded surprisingly accurate. When I thought something, I usually knew exactly what it meant before deciding whether it was polite enough to say out loud. Queen Aerith turned toward me again, her golden eyes thoughtful but warm. Daniel Hayes, she said gently, you have done nothing unusual today. You simply allowed your mind to think naturally. Yet the result has revealed something important to every telepath in this chamber. She slowly turned her gaze back toward the assembled council. Diplomacy often struggles because we try to understand one another through minds trained to conceal their true signals. But today we have heard a mind that does not conceal anything at all. The delegates remained silent, listening carefully as her words settled through the hall. The Queen then spoke one final observation that caused several scholars to exchange sudden glances of realization. If one human mind can be heard this clearly, she said quietly, imagine what would happen if more of them joined the conversation. The statement hung in the air long after the Queen finished speaking, and for the first time since the strange demonstration began, the entire council chamber seemed to understand that something larger than a curious experiment had just unfolded. I stood quietly beside the translator console, aware that every delegate in the room was now looking at the human technician with a level of attention that usually belonged to ambassadors and scientists rather than someone whose original task had been tightening bolts in a cooling system. The scholars were no longer speaking rapidly to one another. Instead, they had become still, studying the data floating above their instruments with the kind of careful silence that followed the discovery of something genuinely new. One of them finally lifted his gaze from the projection and addressed the Queen in a thoughtful tone. "Your Majesty, if the human cognitive pattern remains consistent across their species, this could represent the most stable telepathic reference signal we have ever encountered." The translator repeated the sentence clearly in my ear, and I watched several ambassadors shift forward in their seats as the implication settled through the chamber. Another scholar nodded slowly and added his own observation. A mind without layered psychic interference could serve as a baseline for communication between species that normally struggle to interpret each other. In other words, one delegate murmured quietly, "Humans might become the clearest voices in a room full of telepaths." The phrase moved across the hall like a ripple, and I felt the odd sensation of being both present and slightly outside the moment, as if I were watching someone else become the subject of a diplomatic theory. Queen Aerith remained composed as always, but her golden eyes carried a thoughtful brightness that suggested she had already reached the same conclusion. "For centuries we believed that understanding required stronger telepathic abilities," she said calmly. "But perhaps clarity does not come from hearing more thoughts. Perhaps it comes from hearing fewer of them." Several scholars nodded again while recording the statement, their amplifiers glowing softly rather than flashing with urgency. I crossed my arms loosely and looked around the enormous hall, still trying to adjust to the idea that my brain had suddenly become a topic of interstellar discussion. Back on Earth, nobody would have described my thinking as revolutionary. Most people would have called it straightforward, sometimes even stubborn. Queen Aerith seemed to sense the direction of my thoughts again, because she looked toward me with a faint smile that was almost reassuring. "Daniel Hayes," she said gently, "earlier you believed that your presence here was an accident." I gave a small shrug because that still felt like the most reasonable explanation. The Queen turned toward the council once more before continuing. "But discoveries rarely begin with intention. Sometimes they begin with a simple observation that no one expected to notice." She paused and then spoke with quiet certainty. "Today this council did not simply hear the thoughts of a human. Today we heard what communication sounds like when a mind does not hide behind complexity." The chamber fell silent again as her words settled through the hall. And for the first time since I had climbed that maintenance ladder, I began to realize that what had started as a repair job might quietly change the way an entire alliance listened to each other. For a long moment after the Queen finished speaking, the Imperial Council Hall remained wrapped in a silence that felt deeper than any debate or negotiation the chamber had ever witnessed. The towering crystal pillars reflected the soft glow of drifting constellations above, and the faint hum of the translator console beside me sounded suddenly very small compared to the quiet weight of the realization spreading through the room. I stood there with my hands resting against the edge of the maintenance panel, trying to absorb the strange path the morning had taken. Less than an hour earlier, I had climbed a ladder to fix an overheating communication unit. Now the most powerful council in the Alliance was rethinking the nature of communication itself. The scholars slowly deactivated their amplifiers one by one. The glowing bands dimming as their instruments confirmed the same conclusion again and again. A human mind did not behave like a telepathic one. It did not layer thoughts beneath defensive echoes. It did not hide behind complex neural shielding. It simply formed an idea and held it clearly until the person decided whether to speak it aloud. One of the elder diplomats leaned back in his seat and folded his hands thoughtfully while looking toward the Queen. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "perhaps the greatest difficulty in interstellar diplomacy has never been translation. Perhaps it has been trust." The translator delivered his words gently through the chamber, and several other delegates nodded slowly. Queen Aerith stood calmly at the center of the hall, her silver hair catching the dim starlight projected across the ceiling. For a moment she said nothing. Then she looked toward me again with the same thoughtful curiosity she had shown since the moment she first heard my thoughts. "Daniel Hayes," she said softly, "earlier today you believed you were simply repairing a machine." I smiled a little at that because it still felt true. Most machines were easier to understand than interstellar politics. But the Queen continued in a tone that carried quietly across the hall. "Yet sometimes the smallest moments reveal the clearest truths." She turned toward the gathered council one final time. For centuries, our alliance has depended on complex systems to interpret the intentions of many species. Telepathic networks, layered signals, cautious negotiations. But today we heard something simpler. She paused briefly before finishing the thought. We heard a mind that was not trying to become louder than every other mind in the room. We heard a mind that was simply honest. The chamber remained silent again, but this time the silence felt peaceful rather than uncertain. Several delegates exchanged thoughtful glances while the scholars quietly saved their recordings, aware that the discovery would be studied for years to come. I picked up my wrench again and glanced at the cooling system beside the console, noticing that the final pressure reading had finally stabilized. The repair job was complete. Queen Aerith watched me for another moment, and then allowed a small smile to appear as she returned to the throne platform. For the first time in centuries, she said softly, the council has learned what true clarity sounds like. And it came from the quietest voice in the room.